Please take your seats. We are about to start plenary 2. Find a seat, sit in it, get comfortable. Very good. Hello, plenary 2, how are you? So nice to see you. Stephanie, tell everybody who you are.
Well, Femi, first, thank you very much. I'm Stephanie von Friedeberg. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the International Finance Corporation. IFC is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, and we are the largest financier of private sector projects in emerging markets globally. We work across all sectors, but transport is a big piece of the sector. The question that Femi asked me when I first talked to her is, how did I get here? And so I thought, oh, it's a transport seminar, so what she meant is, how did I get here? So I Ubered to the metro this morning, I took the metro in, I jumped on Lime and rode a scooter the rest of the way, and then I thought, oh, maybe that's not what she really meant. But
I don't believe you did all that to get but it's a good story.
It's a good story.
Yeah.
No, I'm actually a true believer in the paradigm shift of moving the private sector closer to development and closer to what we're trying to do in infrastructure. And I have to look no further than what the bank group has done in the telecom space to know that it's doable. So if you think about what we did in telecommunications, we had the right policy and regulatory environments, we introduced new technologies, and we were able to leapfrog over traditional fixed line SOEs. So if you take Africa, for example, when we started, there were 100 lines per 1,000 people. Today we have full penetration with mobile, and we did that through a combination of technology, the private sector, and the right policy and regulation. We created companies that actually generate revenues for the government, as opposed to companies that are owned by the government and become a financial drag and a financial necessity for the government.
The private sector as a driver of mobility is what we are talking about. Luis, who are you?
Well, I am a CEO of the CCR Mobility Division in Brazil. So we operate metros, trains, ferry boats, and CCR also has highway toll roads and airport services. I started at CCR in 1998, so I have 22 years of working with a concession, especially in PPP models, PPP scams. And I'd like to talk to you about risk mitigation, risk allocation, and the capability of the risk taker to meet their obligation, especially the statement. The government, sorry, especially the state. And I would like to apologize, to ask you to apologize me because of my English limitation.
So Luis, I'm not going to get you to do all of that now, because I just wanted to know who you are, so the audience know who you are as well. And I would like to apologize for my accent. As you can tell, I'm from Maryland.
Okay, so I graduated in mathematics, and I have also in business administration. So during the weekends, I do something interesting, which is to fly a glider. A glider is a kind of airplane without engine, without propeller. So I think I'm very capable to discuss about risk, how to find an airport or an airfield when you don't have enough height to reach there. So this is and my point. And now at CCR Mobility we have around 5,000 employees, and we transport more than 2 million people in a business day.
Dr. Choi, tell us something fascinating about yourself.
Hello. First of all, I'm not a culprit. I'm a discussant today. Then I started my career from the university 28 years, and then I joined last year, 10 or 11 months ago, to cabinet members and vice minister, chairman of Metropolitan Transportation Commission. The mission is to, deals with the metropolitan transportation affairs in terms of railways touching to jurisdictional boundaries and the roads and BLT and etc. Thank you very much.
Lena, it's so nice to have you. You have such a fancy title. Share it with our audience.
So I'm a special secretary in the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways. I'm a career bureaucrat from the Government of India. That sounds very boring, but
You have to convince us otherwise, Lena.
yes. So I write, I sing, and I also work.
Oh, now we're talking.
That's a good mixed bag. Government, well, it's the favorite punching bag for everybody, including the private sector, which is represented in large numbers here. But I can tell you, we are trying to make a difference, and we will make a difference.
Bold. We will find out. Surya.
Good morning and hello. My name is Surya Bagchi, and I am the global head for project and export finance with Standard Chartered Bank. Standard Chartered Bank is an emerging markets focused Asia, Middle East and Africa focused institution. And we do a lot of work in infrastructure and sustainable finance across all the communities we work in. So I'm very excited to be here today. I actually have a show and tell when Femi allows me. I want to talk you through maybe 3 different projects in 3 different continents that we've been involved in and use them as almost like case studies for the discussion.
I love that. I love that you brought your assignment with you. We will continue to talk about this conversation online with hashtag TTDC20. We are already trending in DC. Let's see if we can trend in America and then the world. If you are online, there's no reason why you can't be part of the conversation. If you have a question, it will get through to the digital team back here. They will then write it down on a card. It will go analog from digital, and then it may well come out of my mouth, and you can be part of this conversation. And again, if you're in this room, we have 2 microphones there. I will see you standing. Whenever you feel you need to add something to the conversation that is relevant and on topic, you can do so, and I will fold you into the conversation. We do not have to wait until the end. Picture number 1, just picture number 1. What are you going to show us, Surya, and why is it important?
Okay.
And we can see, actually, speakers, you don't have to crick your neck. You can see that right there. There you go.
Okay. So just a show and tell, as I said. So the first one is a case from Africa. So our bank in Africa finances transportation across a range of different projects. We do, for example, bus rapid transport systems. We've done ports. But this particular example is of an airport. And the reason I chose this is because it's the simplest form of transportation infrastructure financing. The structure that we used here was that the airport was being constructed by the Ministry of Transport of the country in Uganda. And the airport had a very important economic justification because it was necessary for the economic development of that particular province in Uganda, industrial development. But it also would have accessibility as an added advantage. So it had a very strong economic justification. And the way that the project was financed was through a direct borrowing by the Ministry of Finance. So effectively, the Ministry of Finance was the borrower, and the way that the project was financed was with a export credit. In this case, it was UK export credit, which provided a 14-year financing tenor for the project, which matched the project's requirements. And we were also able to blend in with that a commercial facility of 35 million euro. So it brought together...
Surya, Dr. Choi wrote something down. Dr. Choi, why were you writing? You're not in trouble. We just, were you writing about this, or you were writing about something else? About this? No, it was about something else, wasn't it? Okay.
Today, I think the most required word in this forum could be the risk balancing or risk redistribution. That's one point. And the other one is we are experiencing lots of technological development in terms of both transportation technology, like a toll collection and then et cetera. The other one is financial enhancement. So I would like to bring up...
So Dr. Choi, we'll get to that in a moment. I thought you were talking about this project example that Surya was showing us. Surya, can you get to the main point of this? Is it successful? Did it work?
Yes, absolutely successful. It works. It's simple. The advantages of just of this type of an approach, rather than just financing the government, let's say with a loan, is that there's a specific end use which is economically beneficial to the community. It's a matched finance so that the cash flows of how you repay is matched with how the cash flows get generated in the project. There is also an environmental and social diligence which happens as a result of working with international organizations, including export finance and commercial sort of banks, where we do a detailed environmental assessment of the project.
Have you been to this project?
I haven't, but my team has. But I will
I was
go there.
just checking because you're so enthusiastic about it. Thought you'd flown in and flown out.
As soon as the airport's ready, I'll fly in.
Stephanie.
You need that glider. I actually want to jump in here because I think there's an interesting again, about the paradigm shift. How do you bring the private sector in? So there's a $500 billion financing gap year on year for transport in emerging markets. The only way we're going to close it is to crowd in the private sector. So we have a story that we call the tale of two airports. One was in Jordan and one was in Egypt. So the Jordanians came and said, we've bought this brand new fleet of planes. We're spending $30 million a year maintaining our airport. Can you help us? So we helped them concession a PPP. They built a new airport for $675 million, all financed by the private sector through IFC and through a consortium banks and the sponsors themselves. The airport last year made $150 million for the government. Not a cent of government money went into that airport. It's the 50th best airport in the world. So the private sector can start to play in these spaces and free room on a government balance sheet to actually allow that money to be used for the more difficult development challenges.
Why do you think so many people want to talk about risk, Stephanie?
Because we have to make sure as we structure PPPs that we properly allocate risk between the concessionaire, the government, and ultimately the affordability for users.
Lena, you're frowning. Why are you frowning?
Yeah, because risk rebalancing is something which we think is critical for making a project work. And that is why one of our new modes of PPP is what we call, very interestingly, HAM, but it's actually hybrid annuity mode, where the traffic risk is borne by government. So we are the ones who collect the revenue. And we bring 40% of the project costs are brought upfront by government. The private sector brings in only 60%, does not have to take the traffic risk, and gets its repayment of the 60% investment over a 15-year period with bank plus 3% interest. So your investment is captured and the toll revenue is borne, the risk is taken by government. So that is something which is a very new model that India introduced just about 4 years ago. And it's working very successfully. We're looking at more and more investment coming into this mode. And if I'm not mistaken, Surya will also show one of our projects from India. So that was some inside information I had.
So I think that pretty much covers my second case, which is up
Did
on
you
the-
two talk before this session? Did you get together?
So I think, I wanted to move to a more, I would say, from the basic to a little more involved. So the first example I had was of a direct borrowing on the Ministry of Finance balance sheet, but it was asset specific. The second one is, a road and a tunnel project in India, which is through the annuity, method of the National Highways Authority, which Lena just described. The hybrid annuity model works very, very well because it resolves certain issues that were faced in financing roads in India. So firstly, as she said, a part of the project cost is provided by the government as construction assistance, which is 40%, and it is crucially paid in milestones. So it's not paid right up front saying, go have a party. You have to actually demonstrate how the project is constructed. So the way it happens is people bid, and the qualified people bid in terms of people who want to construct the project, and the person who bids the lowest in terms of the cost of construction plus operations wins, and then is paid in milestones over 5 installments.
So always the lowest bidder wins.
Provided you're qualified. You have to first be qualified, because I can't walk in and I won't win because I wouldn't be qualified. But if you're a qualified consortium, then you will win if you have the lowest cost on an NPV basis. One critical aspect is land acquisition, which the government takes care of, which was a cost of which was as an experience of past failures. Second is that the decision to pay out in milestones rather than one lump sum right at the beginning, so that you pay that 40% as the project gets constructed over time. So this, is a model which is causing a lot of positive interest in the private sector. It's successfully financed, it's successfully constructed, and is actually accelerating the pace of how highways are constructed in India.
Oh, question. Hello.
Hello. My name is Tracy Rogic, and I understand risk is a theme of this panel. Could we go back to the photo of the airport, please? I'm just noticing that it's incredibly close to this river. And Uganda experienced torrential flooding last year, or I think in the last 2 years possibly. Given climate, I work on climate change, various issues. Given the impending climate risks, I'm wondering how that was assessed, the climate risks for the placement of this airport, or was it not, especially since developing states have such a challenge with coping post disasters?
I love that question went to you because Surya said, I've got some examples of projects, but can we also talk about climate? And there you go.
Absolutely. So I think that's a great question. Firstly, thanks for it. Specific to this project, it was classified as a Category A project from an environmental and social risk perspective because of potential impact on environment, because of potential of having to resettle people, as well as the potential for the airport to actually disturb heritage in terms of any culturally important milestones which exist in this particular area. So of course there was a detailed study which was conducted, and there was a mitigation plan which was put in place as well. I specifically don't know the answer to the question on the river, but I can assure you that it was a comprehensive Category A assessment following the World Bank and the IFC guidelines. So a comprehensive assessment was undertaken, and a mitigation plan is also in place for the airport. So that's specific to the question. When it comes to sustainable finance, it's something which is an initiative of our bank, not only of our bank, but I think that it's, I would think that we are representative of the financing community here on the private sector, where I think there is a significant amount of work being done in terms of how do you make your financing and your impact on the communities that you're dealing with aligned with the sustainable development goals. So we've gone through the goals, and we've selected some which are particularly relevant for our footprint. And we have a global focus on sustainable finance, and we are trending our portfolio in a direction so that we are aligned with the SDGs. So I, for example, measure what percentage of my portfolio is consistent with SDG, and I have targets in terms of increasing that percentage steadily.
Which SDGs?
So it includes sort of sustainable infrastructure is a big piece of what we are looking to achieve. Renewable energy is another area which is extremely important. We are also trying to address inequalities as well as address poverty. And clean water, I would add to that as one of the priorities in my portfolio.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for bringing your show and tell. I want to move on because we've been dancing around the risk question. Dr. Choi, go ahead.
I think there are many factors affecting the risk, but because I have been into the travel demand forecasting. I think travel TDF, so-called TDF was. Siri is working.
What did Siri respond to?
I don't know.
I'm scared that your Siri responds to risk.
It's too much sensitive. He's always awake. Well, I'm not. Well, in Korean case, first of all, TDF has been used in a wrong manner in some sense. Right now, we have a stakeholder, government sectors and private sectors. Private sectors, of course, have two disseminations. One is a bank group, and the other is a construction group. Construction groups only pursue the PPP in Korea, and the government side, without knowing the much details, I think we pay the tuition, which means some construction companies made a lot of money out of that. But right now, we came up with different version of BTO, like a BTO-A, adjusted or BTO risk sharing, and etc. I think the World Bank type, AP type, BTL is another option. So right now we are more,
sustainable
in handling those matters domestically. But I think What I'm saying right now is a TDF has been used as a tool for private sector to jump in the market. So in that case, 100% of travel demand forecasting, let's say 10,000, the 100,000 volumes per day, and then only, less than half, 40,000 volumes, and then the remaining 60% the government had to, compensate.
I'm going to get Luis to pick up the microphone because you have made him the most animated I've seen him all morning. So he's leaning forward. What do you want to add?
Well, I prefer fly glider, but in any case, when we talk about the demand in case of public transportation and any kind of study that you use, any kind of methodology to predict the demand will fail, for sure. And when it fails, you said the government will take the risk of certain amount of this frustration of the demand. We agree. We have this kind of model in Brazil, and it works. So we predict the demand doesn't happen, and the government doesn't take the part that they promised in contract. And when they do, when they accept the risk, and when the risk appears, he says, okay, I will pay for that, but they don't have the money. And the compensation, because of that, took a long time, and the price and the cost of the money cannot afford this kind of delay. So the problem, I say, is not only risk allocation, risk assessment, and risk mitigation mechanism, but the efficiency of the risk taker to meet this kind of obligation, especially when you get to pay, when the state has to pay. And maybe I can talk after about the demand predictions connected with the obligation of the government, in many cases, maybe in Korea also, to reorganize the entire public transportation system and talk about buses, to cut lines, to reorganize the buses to guarantee that the people from the bus jumped in the metro and back and forth.
As he alluded, I think to minimize the inaccuracy or uncertainty out of the travel demand modeling, there are two sets. One is a data set. That's why Korea standardized the data set that, the study team cannot intentionally exaggerate the demand. The data set is one thing, and because it is a rather smaller country, we can do that. It's data set, and the other is a methodological toolkit, still four-step travel demand forecasting, generation distributed models. It plays a role. So in the near future, maybe with the the AI or some other data is available, I think we can come up with a better solution. But still, it matters.
Stephanie and then Surya.
Yeah, so I would just add, in terms of risk, first, you have to have a fair and balanced concession. Once you have a fair and balanced concession, many of these concessions are very long life. And so having the capacity in the government to be able to manage the implementation of the concession is critical. And I think that's one of the areas where we see a need for more. And we've been working very closely with our colleagues at the World Bank so we can use partial risk guarantees, but we created in IDA 18 something called the private sector window, which is a de-risking tool. And in essence, what it allows us to do is to backstop government guarantees on PPPs in IDA countries so that actually we can bring in more private sector investors to places where we believe the cash flow can be generated through a private model.
So from a private sector commercial bank financing perspective, traffic risk is one of the most fundamental issues that you can face when financing greenfield infrastructure. So when it comes to ports, which are, let's say, captive to a particular part of the coastline, where there's you have an assurance of the kind of volumes that will flow in, particularly, if it is not a transshipment port, but a port which is fundamentally bringing goods in and out of the country, you can actually take a call on, the traffic risk, and we have financed ports, including in Africa with that method. Secondly, I think I'd say that when it comes to greenfield roads, however, the experience has been that there is a tendency to overestimate the traffic flows, at least at the beginning of the project, at the first few years of the project, and that is often a cost of, resulting in transaction failures. However, when a road is already built, like for example in India, there's a toll loan transfer program where there's a road already built and you're looking at asset recycling of those roads, or you're looking at a brownfield expansion converting into 4 or 6 lanes where there's already a traffic demand which is established, then it's easier to do or manage that traffic risk. Femi, do I have your permission to do my last show and tell?
Let me poll the audience. Would you like to see the last show and tell now or later? Now, hands up. Later, hands up. Okay. I think it's now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what a beautiful picture, right? So this is essentially the picture. It's an artist's impression, I think. And this was what was shown to us saying we need to build in Turkey. So this is a $2.3 billion project. It's got a 76 kilometer toll road and this beautiful bridge, which is more than 2 kilometers, 2,023 meters long, to be exact. And so effectively, the issue of traffic risk came up almost immediately when this project was first mooted.
Where is this?
This is in Turkey, in a region called Marmara, which this bridge spans across from Asia to Europe. And it also has significant development implications for the region. But when it was proposed, there was no real traffic study. So you don't really know to what extent the bridge is going to be used. It was all forecast. So effectively, the solution that was devised here is that there was a traffic projection. However, the Ministry of Highways of Turkey stood behind that projection, saying that I'm going to give you a minimum traffic guarantee. So you can go ahead and finance this on the basis of these traffic projections. However, if the traffic projections fall below this, then effectively we will step in and we will make sure that the financing progresses as if that traffic had been plying over the bridge. Or in other words, the shadow toll would be paid by the Ministry of Highway of Turkey to make up the difference. And behind their obligation, the Turkish Treasury stood to say that they would do what is called a debt assumption, to say that if the minimum traffic guarantee was invoked, then the Turkish Treasury would stand behind the obligations of the Ministry of Transport. So using this method, actually this 2.3 billion euro bridge has today been financed and financially closed.
Have you been to the bridge?
Yes.
Okay. Very nice.
Lina, I have to talk to you about what it is that the private sector expects and wants from, I'm going to make it specific, the Indian government.
I think the private sector just doesn't want to take any risk, only the gain, so that's being very provocative. But
Is that irritating for you?
It is, definitely, because this is all about, taking a hit where it is required if you're looking at making the profits as well.
But you're talking to the private sector,
But let me
They're not
talk
gonna want
about
to
the
take a
elephant
hit.
in the room, which is
Please.
disputes.
Mm-hmm.
And dispute resolution, I think, is something which both parties, whether it is government or the private sector, we are all, and we ought to be very concerned about it, because if the traffic is not as per the projections that were made, there were unrealistic traffic projections, there are going to be disputes, because the concessionaire is going to find that he's been short-charged when it actually comes to the implementation over a 30-year concession period. And the other dispute is when the land, which is an obligation of the government, the land acquisition has to be provided at the time when you swore you would provide it as per the agreement that you signed. And in India, in fact, I have no hesitation in saying that a lot of our BOT, build, operate, transfer projects, build, operate, toll transfer projects, did not succeed, or rather they became languishing because the land wasn't provided as per the stipulated time frame. And we've now sorted out these issues. For the last 1.5 years, we have a completely online process for issuance of land notifications. We also have a completely online process now for doing bid evaluations. So we are trying to, the automatic traffic counters do a very realistic assessment of the numbers of traffic, and we're connecting it with the projected growth in the economy, so that there's again a realistic assessment, and the DPRs, which are really the basis for the entire project. That is also being made with the use of radar and LiDAR technology is being utilized. So in a sense, we're trying to mitigate. I will not say completely eliminate. That would be rather too grandiose a statement to make. But we're trying to mitigate the risks to the extent possible from the point of view of the obligations of the government. At the same time, there is some due diligence which we do expect, and I'm sure the private sector does that, which is equally important because you have to come into it with your eyes open. And
Well, if you were going to be very candid with this audience here, an online audience, and you were just going to give them a little talk, this is what you need to understand, private sector, this is the reality, what would you tell them?
well, I would say that you need to look at whether the responsibilities and commitments of both sides are being met with equal amount of honesty. So if the government is committing to provide the land, all the approvals, the tree cutting, the utility shifting, then that on the part of the government is there. At the same time, the mobilization of funds, the financial closure, whatever you promised at the time when you made the bid, those dialogues must happen with the bankers in time to be able to do the financial close once you won the bid on the basis of the L1 award. Sometimes and very often it happens that the entire technical eligibility is there in the L1 bid was taken and awarded, and the concessionaire has actually not tied up with the bank, and the financial close hasn't been achieved. So with everything being in place, with all the stipulation of the land, etc. being in place, the project won't get off the ground. And naturally, it's going to add to the project and time costs and overruns. So that responsibility, I think, is equally on both the sides. We're also moving to an electronic toll collection mechanism in India. As we speak today, almost 70% of our toll is being collected electronically, because in cash collections, there were always doubts. You did not know what were the leakages. You do not know what was the exact quantum of toll that was being realized on every tolled highway. But today we have moved for the last 4 or 5 months. We've been doing it as a drive all over the country. So the electronic toll collection is going to give a very transparent record and estimation of the tolls collected. So with all these efforts that are being made by government, after honestly acknowledging the problems and issues on our part in fulfilling our side of the bargain. The other aspect, which is dispute resolution, again, a robust system with conciliation mechanisms are being put into place, and a lot of our contractors and concessionaires, who I would say for genuine reasons had to go to the arbitration courts, have happily for us brought back those their legal processes and have brought it into the conciliation framework. So that is also succeeding rather well, and that is why we are poised to make a difference insofar as getting more private investment into highway construction in India is concerned.
So I have an example. So about 5 years ago, we partnered with a group called I2, and we put together something called Cube Highways for India. And the idea was to address multiple concerns that you raised. The first was, was the financing available? So this is a platform where we said we would put equity in debt, but we would give them enough debt to be able to acquire 4 or 5 different highway concessions, most of which have been under construction already and have suffered for various reasons, because either the original concessionaire didn't have the financing, they couldn't get the project to close. So these guys have actually come in and taken over either operational or almost operational assets. And I can tell you the one thing that would be critical, well, there's 2 things that will be critical to them. One, that the Indian government continues to help with land acquisition and land issues. And I think the second is that whatever agreement was reached in that concession is actually that the government actually lives up to it.
Let me show you a question. Anyone can take it back here on the plenary. How can we focus specifically on financing for sustainable highways? Who wants to answer that question from online? Sustainable highways.
Maybe I can make a start. So we've been doing some work in terms of how do you actually finance green infrastructure. So and the answer that I think came up is that very often, when you're doing your new project planning, the best thing to do is to build in the green elements of the infrastructure right at the project design itself, because it's very difficult to actually have a project which is already financed and then try to put green into it as an afterthought. So for example, if we are designing highways, then very often the traditional approach is that we need to have gas stations on the sides of the highways at specified intervals. And now what you need to do is to make sure that there's also charging infrastructure for electric vehicles along the highways. So that's just an example, but I think...
Have you seen, where would we see that?
So in any new infrastructure being planned today, in terms of a new highway which is being built, I think in my experience, most governments are already factoring in this to say, when you are designing the highway, you also design the green parts of it in terms of make sure that you've got the charging infrastructure alongside. In Africa, I'm so used now to seeing animal crossings being built into the design, though it does increase the cost quite in terms of the physical dollar cost, but when you factor in the social benefit, then those get mitigated. So 2 examples I think that I have seen.
Hello, what's your question?
Hi, just to follow up on some of the things that you've mentioned around government commitment and getting the government to actually do what it says it will do. A lot of the things that Lena mentioned, such as moving utilities around or acquiring land, are things that depend on agencies outside of the Ministry of Transport. And I'm curious if any of you can make some comments around what are the internal coordination mechanisms that you have seen work successfully between very siloed branches of government that may not be necessarily coordinated, but which are prerequisites in order to get some of these private sector projects out to work and get off the ground.
To address your question specifically, India has a federal structure and we have state governments. And those of us who are in the ministry, we all come from some state government. So I, for instance, I'm from the UP cadre. Uttar Pradesh is the largest state in India. And so therefore, I have an understanding of how things work in the state governments. And it is the state with which we have to work for providing us the land on time, for giving us the tree cutting permissions, for getting the utility shifted. So there is a continuous coordination system that happens, and there is a very high-level monitoring mechanism which is called Pragati. It's a Hindi word which means progress. And this Pragati is a mechanism which is chaired by the Prime Minister, where specific interstate between the central and the state governments, the officers on all sides, it's through video conferencing, and all the departments of the state governments or the concerned ministries in the central government will talk about issues which are holding up the implementation for want of some permission or some clearance that the state government was supposed to provide. And this mechanism has worked very successfully because obviously everybody is then doing their homework. Any project which is not achieving the desired milestones immediately gets allocated into a Pragati review. And then everybody pulls up their socks and make sure that by the time the meeting happens, you've sorted out your internal issues and made sure that you're ready to give whatever were the approvals that you had to give. So within the federal structure, this online land acquisition notification process that I mentioned, that is actually a system which has connected the state government to the ministry simply through one portal, where everybody is just submitting the draft notification and it is moving through the computers, no physical movement of files. And in 1 year alone, from 1,000 notifications in 17-18, we did 3,000 notifications in 18-19, in just a year since it was launched, because the system has eliminated delays, mistakes. And that has given the confidence to the private sector that land is going to be provided as per the commitment.
Luis, ask Lena a question about that process.
Well, I'm going to move to India because it seems that the things is going well over there. I'd like to add a comment not about the highways and not about the great land buying process and this kind of thing, but in a urban area, in public transportation like a subway or train. Sometimes, I'm talking about Brazil and the law over there. We have to sign a contract with, usually with a city government, with the mayor, or with the state, the government of the state. But from time to time, you get money from the federal government. So in this case, in our case, for instance, in Bahia State, we had a contract to build 33 kilometers of railway, 2 lines, 20 stations, 7 terminals, something like 6 billion reais. It's $1.5 billion, and we have done that in 3 years, and it is already working this project. But the main problem was not the land. The main problem was between the state government and the municipal, how can I say, the city government, because they are politically in opposition side. So, but the city didn't sign the contract. So in Brazil, we don't have a coordination. When you have a kind of this kind of public transportation infrastructure, it touches a lot of cities in a big metropolitan area. Imagine São Paulo city. We have more than 13, 14 million people using the public transportation a day, a business day. It's a huge, and we have more than 30, 40 cities inside the metropolitan area. So there is something that I'd like to ask the World Bank and all the organized societies to create a kind of a metropolitan authority, someone that can talk to the private sector instead of to talk with so many different city mayors and state government and federal government. We need only one authority, maybe like we have in India, so that's why I'm going to move to India, because it seems that over there it's more organized.
Hello, sir.
I'm Bob Hershey. I'm a consultant. What is being done to hold meetings online and get more transparency and getting the commitments of the funding and setting the requirements?
I assume the question is for India. So the online system.
Everybody.
The online system that you refer to, well, the online system for land acquisition is a very transparent and error-free system. You cannot add anybody's name. You cannot remove somebody's name once the notification has been moved through the online process. And we all know in the physical file movement, a lot of things can happen. So we've eliminated that altogether. The evaluation of the bids that are submitted by the bidders at the time of the projects, those bid evaluation, also the manual intervention is being done away with. Even as I speak, from the 1st of January this year, we've made it compulsory that all evaluations shall be online, which means the time and the, let us say, undesirable human interventions are going to be done away with. And it is going to be fast-tracked, much more efficient and transparent systems. When we talk about the online review systems, since it's a huge country, 1.3 billion and counting, we can't have our officers come all the time to Delhi for meetings. So we do a lot of these video conferencings and in fact the Pragati review, which I mentioned, is all through video conference, where all the states and the central government, we're all sitting in our own offices connected, through the video conference mechanisms. And we're real time discussing the issues and the problems and giving commitments, which in the very next meeting are going to be taken up. So these are the steps that are being taken to ensure that there is adherence to the timelines that have been assured for implementation from whatever the government had to do, and also to resolve genuine issues that the private sector is facing in implementation of the projects.
Dr. Choi, I'm just interested from the Korean perspective, would you then do a lot of the bureaucracy that's involved in new projects? Would you do that online in Korea?
Oh, I think we don't have a system well established in online, but the whether it is a road case or railroad case, we have a dedicated committee, ad hoc committee, forming in a very random manner to avoid any connections from interpersonal things and all that.
Lina called it undesirable human interventions. I love that. That's my life right there.
Next question. Actually, let's go to the back microphone. Hello.
Thank you, Femi. Claudia Driasola with WRI. This year is going to happen in Sweden, the third ministerial conference on road safety. 1.3 million people die every year. My question is, how is the financial sector going to contribute to build roads that don't kill people? Thank you.
Whew, it's a good question. Who wants to take it?
Well, I mean, I would actually start with our performance standards and the Equator principles that we have rolled out to 93 banks, and you actually referred to them. So, you know, you're a member of the Equator principles. You're the chair. Okay, so there we have it. So, you know, we have 93 commercial banks around the world that have taken our performance standards, and our performance standards speak to things like road safety to try to ensure that as we finance projects in emerging markets, they're actually financed appropriately and with the right safeguards in place.
Anybody else want to take that? Everybody's happy?
I think it's a good step on part of the financing authorities, because ultimately we have to insist that there are right number of road safety experts with the companies which are proposing to take the loan for investing, for building a highway or any, I would say even an urban road. It may not be a highway, but an urban road also has to have those commitments and safeguards. And therefore we, from government, we are trying to build up a pool of trained road safety auditors. Just 4 days ago in India, we had our road safety conference, and there we've signed MOUs with 10 technology institutes all over the country so that we can have a very standardized training program for road safety auditors and auditors at every level, so that the consultants also have auditors in their team, the independent engineers who are like the supervision consultants, the DPR consultants, and last but not least, the contractors who are actually going to execute the projects. They must have trained road safety auditors in their, in their personnel and their staff. So I think there is an equal level of importance that has to be given by the governments in making this mandatory and in providing that those numbers of personnel are actually created, because there is a shortage in India. So we can't talk about making it mandatory and not have the wherewithal to provide those kind of trainings. We are trying to tackle the problem from both the sides.
Hello.
Yes, Michael Replogle, Deputy Commissioner for Transportation Policy for New York City. How can private and public sector finance institutions do more and more effectively to help create intermediaries that can put together and bundle small-scale traffic safety projects, pedestrian and cycle improvement projects, and public transport operational improvement projects into packages that are more readily financed by large institutions that seek large financing tranches as opposed to one-off financing of small projects?
See, Michael, you work in New York. Why are you even asking that question? I'm scared now.
Because New York City is a rare city that has a great deal of institutional and capital capacity, and many cities across the world don't have that same capacity. Many cities across the world are hobbled by national governments who act as the primary intermediary with global finance.
Right, so Michael, I think that you are asking this as a global question. You're not asking this because you're stuck in New York.
Correct. I'm asking because New York is embedded in the world and we care about creating a more sustainable...
All right, are you just showing off? Typical New Yorker.
I've been in this space for a while.
Sit down. Sit down, New York. Yes. Plenary. Shall we indulge New York?
So we love New York, so that's good.
Yeah.
It's nice to have you here, actually. Nice to be in Washington, where we have a metro that is clean and works, right?
Yeah. And we have smaller rats.
Yes, exactly. So you know, I talked a little bit about Cube Highways, but this idea of creating and helping to create as a financier platforms where we have a sponsor who is willing, we would be willing to take an equity investment, we would be willing to bring sponsors together and give them the financing to do multiple projects across one platform is one of the ways where we really believe we can help solve those problems. The other thing that we've done, so across the World Bank group, so IFC has a special program called its Cities Program, where we've actually begun to work with bankable cities to lend money to municipalities to actually do some of these smaller projects. So we've done some very interesting work in Turkey. We've spent about the last 10 years in Izmir doing multiple projects where we've had them grow their capacity to build these projects. We're doing something very similar in Ukraine now. So we have 5 projects in Ukraine. We just closed a big deal in Colombia, in Bogota. So you're seeing us work more and more with the municipalities to actually help them solve those problems.
I was teasing New York. I love New York, and it was an excellent question. At the back, hello.
Hey, good morning. I'm Ravi Pandapureddy. I work as Director of Transportation for Regional Planning Agency in Louisiana, way south of here, where it's hot. So I have a question. I've worked closely with local governments and state governments, and I've seen when governments change, priorities change, policies change, how is risk planned for change in governments, change in policies?
That is a fantastic question. India's really interesting right now. It's not an issue in India for quite a while, right?
Well, our documents, our concession documents don't change. So that the national highways, which we implement from the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways across the country, across the states, there are standard bidding documents, and there are very specific manuals and guidelines and standards and specifications. They don't change with the change of the political party in any state. So the way we would approach a 2-lane or a 4-lane, highway or an expressway, what is going to be the commitment in terms of the time frame for land, etc., that is not going to change, and that understanding is there in the private sector also, that across the last few years, we have really tried to focus on PPP in the transport sector in the last, I would say, 10, 12 years in a big way. So our concession agreements are driven by the central government, the ministry of which I am a representative here, and that is something which is frozen. We keep change. By frozen, I don't mean that they are rigid and they are not open to change. In fact, we are going, even as I speak, we are going through the process of making some requisite changes in our BOT toll document to accurately reflect the concerns of the investors and also to take into account our own experiences in execution. But those changes, once they are done, would not vary from one state to the other, if that answers your question.
Was that skepticism I saw on your face, Luis?
Well, in Brazil, it's not like that, you know. I'll give you an example in Rio de Janeiro city. I don't know if any of you have been there. We have a very beautiful public transportation, a light railway vehicle we call VLT do Rio de Janeiro. And the previous mayor signed a contract with us, and we have done our part. They didn't do their part because of the demand frustration, and they have to pay us a few amount of money, but they have to pay. But he said, you signed it with the other mayor, not with me, so I'm not going to pay. Yes, so they changed the mayor, they tried to change the contract. But the contract cannot be changed.
So
like
what happened? What happened?
What happened? We, under the law in Brazil, we are obliged to continue to operate because it's a public service and we cannot stop. So we enter in the court. We ask for the judge to establish the rebalance, and we have spent already 2 years and we didn't find a solution. So this is a kind of risk that I prefer, or to move to India or to fly my glider, because it's really hard to manage in Brazil. And of course, this example is a very good example because we built the infrastructure, we are operating, the people are very satisfied with the system. We transport more than 150 people a day, but we don't get our money yet.
So, Femi, it's a really important point. And again, if you go back to this notion that there's a $500 billion gap in infrastructure financing to meet the SDGs, we need to find a way to ensure that concessions are consistent across governments, because what ultimately happens is a government loses credibility. To attract the private sector, it needs to build its infrastructure when it reopens concessions. And you might think, okay, well, this only happens in the poorest countries or the most fragile countries. If you look at what happened in Mexico very recently, there was an election, and the concession for the airport, which was half built, was pulled. And we had sponsors who said, maybe Mexico's not the right place for us to be investing today.
yeah.
So it's a really important and critical piece if we want to meet the SDGs, to help governments figure out how we can make those concessions last for their life.
Hello, at the front microphone.
Hi, my name is Anna, and I live and work in Kampala, Uganda. And I'd like to ask the panel to focus the conversation on who transport is for. And my question is directed to Femi. I have been to the airport, and I'm asking you who that is built for, who are the users? And if your answer is not that it's the citizens of Hoima, the residents, or the residents of the places those planes are going to, I'd like to ask the panel to talk about PPP projects that are meant for the urban poor and how they're financed, what the business model is.
Thanks again for the question. The airport, the primary reason, as I tried to cover, when I was speaking, the primary reason for constructing an airport there was for development of the economy, because essentially it was to develop, infrastructure for the energy sector. And that was the basic driver for developing the airport. Because without that, there would not be enough, I would say, the cash flow, ability for the airport to service its debt obligations. That being said, a big social benefit arising from the airport would be connectivity for the people of Hoima as well, to be able to use it. So it's an example.
Who, though? Who in Hoima is my question.
No, who in Hoima is like, once you have an airport, the hypothesis is that firstly the airport is developing the economy of Hoima in terms of the the energy sector, because that was the immediate driver, so that equipment could be flown in for the energy sector to be developed, and then that would lift the overall economy of Hoima and benefit the population of Hoima, also enable them to use the infrastructure of the airport. The economy would develop as a result of the airport, so it would create jobs. At the same time, it would also facilitate transport linkages.
I feel you're saying something, but you're not saying it explicitly. Say it explicitly.
So, Standard Chartered Bank is my bank, and you guys do a lot of great social work. I want to start with that. But that airport was developed for oil exploration in the northwest of Uganda. And I live in Uganda, and I am, upper middle class resident. And nobody I know uses that airport. And the majority of people in Uganda and our cities and villages are poor, right? So they're not using these large-scale infrastructure projects that we're talking about. And I am wondering how you design PPP models that serve the urban poor and improve transport. And I would like to hear more of a dialogue on that on this panel.
Stephanie, I'm going to throw it straight to you.
Yeah, I would say I think it's very important.
Thank you.
So I talked about needing a balanced concession. And in my view, a balanced concession has three components. It has to be affordable to the government, it has to be affordable to the users, and it has to be bankable and financially sustainable for the concessionaire. And to get those three pieces in place, I think it becomes incumbent on institutions like the World Bank Group to figure out how we layer different kinds of financing into those PPP concessions so that there is concessionality. So we might use blended finance, we might use the private sector window, we might think about using a PRG from the World Bank, but still making it a private sector project. So we actually have somewhere in the range today of $1 billion to $2 billion of blending money that we've gotten from donors that we can actually put into the financial structure of some of these projects to actually pull down the cost both to the government and to the users so that you can build urban transport that covers a broader scope of citizens.
I'm just thinking out loud, does it matter if private sector money goes into large-scale projects and then government or public sector money goes into projects that are for most citizens, so that they're thinking about the people and the government is thinking about industry or that kind of thing.
Well, I think that's true, Femi. I
I'm
think
just
I
asking
said
as
that
a
before, right? So
everyday
how do we
citizen.
use the limited capacity that's left on government balance sheets for the most difficult development challenges and put in the private sector what can be financed in the private sector? And that's really what we mean by the cascade, which is our new approach to how does the World Bank Group work together and decide what should the private sector do, what should be some kind of a blend in the middle, and ultimately what should we actually lend money to the government to do.
Can I just add to that to say that a very important objective of development is for countries to have a list of prioritized projects, and the list of prioritized projects, some of them would be economic development, like we just had this discussion around Hoima, but they are also very important to prioritize projects which have big social benefits. To your point, so for example, there are a lot of bus rapid transport projects which are being financed across Africa, and there's a big social benefit of doing that, and it addresses mobility, in the context that you were talking about. And effectively, you can effectively use blended finance, because while Hoima Airport, the cash flows might sustain because of the economic development impact and industrial development, including oil, in many other cases, you might find that the social benefit of the project is very high. The cash flows may not explicitly represent that, and that is where you could bring in support into the capital structure, including through grants, including through blending different sources of financing to make the private sector financing also useful in that context. So my answer would be that in order to sustainably address the infrastructure financing gap, it's actually necessary for blended finance and for the private sector and public sector to work together. So there'll be if we polarize, which is if the private sector only does the Hoimas, and the development finance only goes to BRT, we'll still leave a lot of financing which is unaddressed, because there's not enough financing to go around in the polarized context. Blended, where we work together to address this, will result in a much more sustainable and complete financing for all projects.
So, in the near term, I would also add, I think the private sector brings innovation. So we've seen some very interesting young companies that do things like create a platform that allows tuk-tuks and small, commuter buses to have better routes to pick people up so that they're actually more efficient and it's cheaper for the riders to get there in a more direct fashion. We actually just financed a really interesting company in Africa called Kobo 360, which is exactly that, only it's for trucks. It's an Uber for trucks. And it has given truck drivers 1.5 times salary increase and made them more effective and efficient and been better for the environment. So not all problems that relate to urban poor will be solved by large municipal or large infrastructure projects. Some can actually be solved by kind of young startups.
Well, if you want to include the poor people to use the public transport, you have to talk and add in this conversation subsidies. And the World Bank and the Multilateral Development Bank should think about that. How to finance the government in poor area to subsidy the public transportation. The people doesn't have money to pay in Salvador City, in Bahia State in Brazil. They have money just to go from their home to downtown to try to get some money to buy the ticket to come back to home. So we need to talk about subsidies, but the government doesn't have budget to that. So we have to find solution. The bank has to try to help us to find solution to guarantee subsidies. That's the way to include poor people in the public transportation.
Question at the back.
Hi, my name is Rahmat. I'm from Afghanistan. I'm currently a grad student in Houston, Texas. So I've worked for 1.5 years in public transportation department in Kabul. So my question is from the panel that as everyone knows that a public transport project, it's a service more than a business. So how can we encourage and involve the private sector in financing or either involvement in operation of that services? And as Mr. Luis just mentioned, there are many people who can't pay. If we put the fare very high, so most people can't pay and that service will fail. So what are the ways to involve the private sector in that?
Dr. Choi.
Good question. I think the public transportation, basically, that when it comes to public transportation, we already heard about the poor and inequality issues as well, but the fare comes first, I think. But the problem is, with fare only, we can't justify private sector are not completely satisfied by collecting fares, even if the demand is very high. So I think it's time to think about some kind of combo-style enterprise like LNP, rail, and property issues in Hong Kong, for example. But again, it is not targeting the inequality solving. But anyway, in Korea as well, the fare is rather restricted by our sector as well, and by the Department of Money, which is the Ministry of Finance and Economy. So prices are regulated. So fare, even if it's very nice and very fast, okay, we are trying to deploy the system called GTX, and then it's right now it's 90%, 90 minutes or 100 minutes from A to B, but it's going to be only 20 minutes or 25 minutes. But there is a cap still, even if there is value of time, things, it shouldn't be over than 4,000 or 5,000. So I think it's, while maintaining those kind of fare cap, it's time to think about other features of infrastructure building. For example, middle-income targeted apartment around the stations like a TOD or whatever. But in so doing, it's a blended more wonderful blended money come into authorities one thing, and the central government is one thing, and local government and private sectors, and then fares.
Dr. Choi, when you said the fare comes first, Luis didn't look like he agreed.
Well, let's try to be political. In Brazil, it's different. Well, the toll, or not the toll, but the public transportation fare comes after. So we have a model in which the private sector has a fixed price or a fixed, how can I say, income per person transported. And the public sector or the policy is to establish the fare as the public can pay. So that's why there is a difference. Maybe sometimes they cannot collect enough money to pay us, so we talk about subsidies. So the difference between the collected fare to the payment to the private sector must be provided somehow. And my suggestion is to charge the cars, to charge the private vehicle, to charge the private transportation instead of the public.
Charge the car drivers for the public transportation.
Well, Lena was not impressed. Lena, pick up the microphone.
I think
Lena has a car.
That would, yeah. I think that would be looking at the wrong end of the stick with due apologies. Perhaps we have to look at a model where, if the private sector is in India, in fact, the intra-city bus movement is largely driven by the state transport undertakings. And that is another issue which we are trying to grapple with, because they have to expand their fleet operations. Where does the investment come from? And they have to bring in efficiency in the way they manage their bus operations. So how can they increase non-fare revenues? Because you cannot increase ticket prices beyond a point. It's not possible, it's not affordable, it's not fair. So can we look at something where, as we were discussing in the earlier part of the conversation today, where let us say the banks, the funding organizations actually have a much more affordable rate of interest, much more, let us say, encouraging terms and conditions for the private sector to invest. So unless the banks are prepared to take a haircut on these projects for public transportation, if they are going to be at the same terms and conditions that are there for any very, very good commercial operations and very good bankable projects, then the private bus operations are never going to succeed. So we have to really look at how, when we talk about blended finance and different models and a different portfolio mix, what is the maximum benefit that can consciously be given for intra-city bus operations? Because that is the killer. And that is why the kind of strategy that we have to take cars off the roads, unless we have a good and very high standard of bus transportation, a very good network of buses, we will not have the commuters like you and me actually use the buses. Let's be very honest about it. So how do we get there? Are only the people who can't afford anything else using the buses? Sadly, that is a fact of life. Can we migrate from cars to buses and not just to the Uber and Ola type of shared taxis? It's a good model, but it's not going to replace cars, not going to take cars off the roads in the long run. So if we are going to have sustainable public transportation and be able to have private buses or even the public sector undertakings who are running the transport networks, we have to have better financing models. And we have to have the World Bank think of how to put in the money, the right kind of a mix to encourage this kind of development. It can't happen the way it has been happening so far. Something different has to be done.
I think I'll just add to that to say that, if we go back to Leena's explanation about the hybrid annuity, how that worked. So 40% was construction finance. If you look at it from another lens, that 40% represents almost like a blended finance approach to say we know that if you give 100% of the cost to the private sector, there's a social benefit which is not being captured in the cash flows of the project. And that 40% represents essentially the construction assistance which is being given to the project. So a similar approach actually to transportation, like financing the state buses, would be a perfect example of how a blended approach could be used to solve the same issue, because there is a gap between what is required in terms of cash flows to finance the project and affordability.
Let's see if we lob the ball back into the court of government.
I think it would be a sustainable solution if we had an MDB, DFI, government and private sector work together with that approach.
The financiers will have to sit together and look at a more generous and equitable financing model for public transportation. I would put it like that.
I'd like to add to agree with the Indian model from Leena, is to efficiency goals in a private sector concession contract, put efficiency goals and we go ahead. So in our case in Brazil, in São Paulo State and São Paulo Subway, we have Line 4. It's a driverless system. We transport 450 people a day with only 10 stations. And we have the cost per passengers less than 1/3 from the public company, compared with the public company. So we are 1/3 better.
So
2/3 better.
The one thing that I would say is I think we need to be very clear that commercial financiers, so commercial banks, are not going to take a lower risk return trade-off for a public transport. The only way that happens is, as you rightly said, a combination of international financial institutions, donor money, and private sector to get the balance that is fair and equitable so that you get all three of the legs together.
I'm almost out of time. Out of the two of you, who has the best question? Who is I am a genius, this question's going to kill. Oh, yeah. Do not argue, you're wasting the question time. All right, and it is one sentence.
I don't have a
long.
question, I have maybe an idea that might work.
All right, it's a 30-second idea.
So whenever you build a new public transport system, BRT or a metro rail, there's a lot of spillover development that happens across the corridor where economy grows, a lot of development comes along. So I think there should be a value capture from that growth, which needs to be put back into that as sort of a subsidy. Because if you look at the metro rail here in Virginia, the moment you build a new station, and there's new condos, there's new businesses that come up there, there's a lot of profits. There should be a mechanism where you capture some sort of a mechanism, some policies where some of that goes back into the system.
Thank you. Deftly done. Plenary, thank you very much. Good conversation. Thank you, audience. Plenary, you need to leave the stage very quickly. You don't even have time to shake hands and congratulate each other, but the audience will do that for you. Thank you. He's back. Fantastic. Wonderful.
It's so chaotic in Brazil. I love it. And so smooth in India. Excellent. All right. We are not done. This is not a toilet break. We are going to dim the lights. And we are going to stop talking because the program continues. Nice job. Stephanie, your peeps are chatting. They're congratulating you. Do take a seat for a moment. We're going to dim the lights. There's a video that I really want to show you. Gentlemen at the end, congratulations. Let's keep the noise down. Let's dim the lights. Take a look at this video, everybody.
No one is perfect. So why shouldn't city streets and roads be designed to protect pedestrians, cyclists, and drivers who make mistakes? Preventable traffic crashes kill 1.35 million people and severely injure 50 million more worldwide each year. But this can be changed. The Vision Zero Challenge is a rallying cry to city leaders to save lives by taking bold actions on road safety. Because even one road death or serious injury is unacceptable. Urban leaders around the world are making a difference by taking responsibility for building a safe system. The Vision Zero Challenge is looking for mayors in Latin America and the Caribbean who want to make bold changes to policy, street design, and more to save the lives of their citizens. Join the Vision Zero Challenge and share your success in making cities safe for everyone.